November 12, 1983. A Tuesday morning in Arlington, Virginia, with frost clinging to windshields and the metallic taste of winter hanging in the air. Danny Kowalski pulled his work van into the driveway of a modest colonial house on Sycamore Street, the kind of neighborhood where American flags hung from porches and station wagons sat in driveways, where nothing ever seemed out of place. He was just a cable television installer for Continental Cable Company, arriving to fix a reported signal issue. He had no idea that in the next 45 minutes he would stumble upon one of the most carefully guarded Soviet intelligence operations on American soil, a discovery that would unravel a spy network operating for nearly 2 decades. The homeowner believed his routine service call would be completed without incident, perhaps even boring. The Soviet intelligence apparatus believed their deep-cover operative, living under the name Richard Hammond for 17 years, was untouchable, invisible, perfectly integrated into American suburban life. They were all catastrophically wrong. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Danny Kowalski had been installing cable television systems for 6 years, ever since returning from his tour with the army in Germany. At 31 years old, he prided himself on being thorough, the kind of technician who crawled into cramped attics and dusty crawl spaces without complaint, who traced every wire until he found the problem. His supervisor called him obsessive. His wife called him dedicated. Danny just called it doing the job right. His route that Tuesday took him through some of Arlington's quieter neighborhoods, the kind of areas where professionals lived, government workers and contractors who made their living in the vast bureaucratic machinery that surrounded Washington. Danny had grown up in Pittsburgh, the son of Polish immigrants who had come to America seeking opportunity and stability. His father had worked in the steel mills for 30 years, coming home each evening covered in grime, but proud of an honest day's work. That work ethic had been passed down to Danny, along with a natural mechanical aptitude and a stubborn refusal to leave a job half done. The army had refined those qualities. During his 3 years stationed in Frankfurt, Danny had worked in communications, maintaining the intricate web of telephone and data lines that connected military installations across West Germany. The work required precision and attention to detail, qualities that the military had drilled into him through countless inspections and equipment failures that could not be tolerated. He had also received security briefings about Soviet intelligence activities, standard procedure for anyone with access to communications infrastructure in a frontline Cold War posting. Those briefings had covered surveillance techniques, how to recognize unusual equipment, the importance of reporting anomalies. At the time, sitting in a stuffy briefing room in 1977, Danny had thought it was all rather abstract, the kind of thing that happened to other people in spy novels. After his discharge, Danny had returned to civilian life with the practical skills to work in the booming cable television industry. The 1970s and early 80s saw explosive growth in cable subscriptions as Americans embraced the expanded channel offerings and clearer reception. Companies like Continental Cable were hiring technicians as fast as they could train them, and Danny's military experience made him a natural fit. He started as an installation technician, running cables into homes and businesses, and quickly developed a reputation for reliability and thoroughness. While other technicians might take shortcuts, leaving exposed wiring or barely adequate connections, Danny treated each installation as if it were permanent, as if his name and reputation rode on every connection he made. His wife, Margaret, worked as a nurse at Arlington Hospital. They had married just before his deployment to Germany, and she had waited faithfully through those years of separation. Writing letters weekly and managing their small savings with care, they had a modest house in Springfield, a mortgage they were slowly paying down, and dreams of starting a family once they felt more financially secure. Danny's job paid reasonably well, with overtime opportunities during peak installation seasons, and he had been saving steadily toward a down payment on a larger house. Life was predictable, comfortable, exactly the kind of stable middle-class existence his parents had immigrated to America to achieve. Nothing in Danny's experience had prepared him for what he was about to encounter on Sycamore Street. He pulled his van to the curb, gathered his tool bag and testing equipment, and walked up the driveway with no sense of premonition. It was just another service call, one of 8 scheduled for that day. The house at 4723 Sycamore Street appeared unremarkable in every way. Richard Hammond, the resident who answered the door, matched the neighborhood perfectly. Mid-40s, graying at the temples, wearing khaki pants and a cardigan sweater over a button-down shirt. He worked as a mid-level analyst at a consulting firm that did contract work for various government agencies, a job that required security clearance but nothing too exotic. His wife taught 4th grade at the local elementary school. They had 2 teenage children who played soccer and got decent grades. Neighbors considered them pleasant but private, the kind of family you waved to while mowing the lawn, but rarely invited over for dinner. Sycamore Street itself embodied the American suburban ideal of the early 1980s. The houses, mostly colonials and split levels built in the 1950s and 60s, sat on quarter-acre lots with mature oak and maple trees lining the sidewalks. Each home had a carefully maintained lawn, many flying American flags, and driveways occupied by sedans and station wagons. Children rode bicycles in the street after school. Fathers worked on weekend home improvement projects. Mothers organized neighborhood potlucks and school fundraisers. It was the kind of place where people knew their immediate neighbors, but not necessarily everyone on the block. Where privacy was respected, and unusual behavior might be noticed but rarely questioned directly. Richard Hammond had lived on Sycamore Street for 12 years, having moved there in 1971 when his employer relocated him from Philadelphia. The neighbors who remembered his arrival recalled a polite family who quickly integrated into community life. Hammond joined the neighborhood association. His wife volunteered at the school. Their children played with other kids in the area. Over time, they became part of the scenery, familiar faces who generated no particular interest or concern. Hammond's wife, known to everyone as Patricia, was well liked by parents and teachers alike. She taught with enthusiasm and patience, known for creative bulletin boards and a knack for reaching struggling students. She hosted classroom parties at Halloween and Valentine's Day, chaperoned field trips, and served on the school improvement committee. Her colleagues considered her dedicated but somewhat reserved, friendly but not given to sharing deeply personal information. She spoke occasionally about her childhood in upstate New York, about Richard's work requiring frequent travel, about their hopes that their children would attend good colleges. Their son, Michael, was 16 and played midfielder on the high school soccer team. He was a B student, neither exceptional nor struggling, the kind of teenager who blended into the crowd. He had friends but was not part of the popular cliques, enjoyed science fiction movies and working on his car, a used Datsun that spent more time broken down than running. Neighbors who knew him described him as polite and quiet, the type who helped carry groceries without being asked and mowed lawns for spending money. Their daughter Jennifer was 14 and deeply invested in her schoolwork. She took advanced classes, played clarinet in the school band, and kept a careful distance from the social drama that consumed many of her peers. Teachers saw promise in her, suggesting she consider challenging colleges when the time came. She babysat for several families on Sycamore Street, known as responsible and good with younger children. To all outward appearances, the Hammond family represented everything the neighborhood valued. They were stable, contributing members of the community who caused no problems and generated no concern. If Patricia Hammond seemed occasionally distracted, if Richard traveled more than seemed typical for someone at his level, if the family seemed to keep emotional distance, even while participating in community events, these were minor quirks attributed to personality rather than anything sinister. The home itself reflected this careful normality. The exterior was well maintained, but not ostentatious, painted in neutral tones that blended with surrounding houses. The lawn was mowed regularly, the shrubs trimmed, the gutters kept clear. Inside, the decor was comfortable but generic, the kind of furniture and art found in thousands of similar middle-class homes across America. Family photos lined the hallway, showing birthdays and holidays, soccer games and school events, the documented evidence of a life being lived. Richard Hammond led Danny through the living room, apologizing for the inconvenience. His voice carried a hint of something Danny could not quite place, an almost imperceptible flatness to certain vowels that most Americans would never notice. "The cable signal keeps dropping out during the evening news," Hammond explained, gesturing toward the television set in the den. "It is quite frustrating. We have tried adjusting the antenna connection, but nothing seems to help." Danny nodded, already running through potential causes in his mind. Evening dropout suggested interference, possibly from a neighbor's equipment or a loose ground connection somewhere in the system. He explained that he would need to check the connections throughout the house, starting with the junction box outside and working his way through the attic to trace the cable routing. "Of course," Hammond said, a touch too quickly. "Whatever you need to do. I will be in my study if you need anything. Just knock before entering that room, please. I have some work materials that cannot be disturbed." The slight tension in Hammond's voice when mentioning his study registered in Danny's mind, but he thought nothing of it at the time. People were often protective of their home offices, especially those who worked with classified materials. Danny had installed cable in dozens of homes with similar restrictions. He collected his tools and headed outside to begin his inspection. The junction box showed normal signal strength, ruling out an external line problem. Danny methodically checked each splitter and connection point, finding everything properly grounded and sealed against moisture. That meant the issue was somewhere inside the house, most likely in the attic where the main cable distribution system ran between rooms. Hammond reluctantly provided access to the attic through a pull-down ladder in the upstairs hallway. As Danny climbed into the dark, insulated space, his flashlight beam cut through the dusty air, illuminating a maze of wooden joists, pink insulation, and the expected tangle of electrical wiring and cable television lines. He began his methodical inspection, following the black coaxial cable from its entry point through the roof. About 15 minutes into his work, as he was checking a particularly complex junction where the cable split to serve different rooms, Danny noticed something that made him pause. Running parallel to the cable television line, carefully secured with small plastic clips every few feet, was a thin grey wire that definitely was not part of the cable system. It was too fine, too deliberately hidden under the insulation, and it ran in the wrong direction. The attic was stiflingly hot despite the November chill outside. Heat from the house below rose through the insulation, creating a warm, dusty atmosphere that made Danny's shirt stick to his back. The smell of old wood and fiberglass insulation filled his nose, and dust particles danced in the beam of his flashlight, creating a surreal, almost dreamlike quality to the space. Pink insulation bats lay between the joists, some compressed and aged, others newer where repairs had been made. Electrical wiring snaked through the rafters in the expected locations, running to light fixtures and outlets below. The cable television line he had been tracing made logical sense in its routing, following the most direct path from the external connection point to the various rooms requiring service. But this grey wire was different. For one thing, it was far too thin for any standard residential purpose. Electrical wiring had to meet code requirements for gauge based on the current it would carry. Telephone wiring had a specific appearance and routing. The cable television coaxial line was thick and distinctive. This wire was none of those things. It looked more like the kind of antenna wire used for radio equipment, but even that did not explain its careful concealment under layers of insulation. Danny followed it with his flashlight, his heart beginning to beat faster. The wire had been installed with professional skill, secured at regular intervals to prevent sagging or movement, carefully positioned to avoid any contact with electrical lines that might cause interference. Whoever had run this wire knew what they were doing and had taken pains to ensure it would remain undetected during any casual inspection. The plastic clips holding it in place were the kind used for low-voltage wiring, nearly invisible against the wood they were attached to. As he carefully pulled back insulation to trace the wire's path, Danny became increasingly aware of how deliberate the installation was. This was not some amateur home project, not a forgotten remnant of an old radio antenna or intercom system. The wire maintained consistent depth below the insulation surface, always at least 3 inches under, enough to avoid detection from someone simply looking around the attic with a flashlight. Only by physically moving the insulation, as Danny was doing to trace the cable television line, would someone encounter it. His military training began to assert itself over his initial curiosity. In Germany, during security briefings, They had been shown examples of clandestine communications equipment. The wires gauge, its careful installation, the deliberate concealment, all began to add up to something that made Danny deeply uncomfortable. He had assumed he left the world of intelligence concerns behind when he returned to civilian life. The idea that he might be looking at evidence of espionage here in a suburban attic in Arlington seemed almost absurd. Yet his training had been clear about one thing. When something does not make sense, when equipment appears where it should not, the proper response is caution and documentation. Danny's hands shook slightly as he continued following the wire. Part of his mind insisted there had to be a rational, innocent explanation. Maybe Hammond was an amateur radio enthusiast who had installed equipment years ago and forgotten about it. Maybe it was part of some exotic home security system. Maybe it had been installed by a previous owner, and Hammond did not even know it existed. But these explanations felt hollow, even as Danny considered them. The installation was too recent. The wire showed no signs of age or dust accumulation like everything else in the attic. This had been placed here within the past year, possibly within the past few months. The wire terminated at a small junction box, no larger than a pack of cigarettes, tucked behind a roof support beam. Unlike everything else in the attic, which wore years of dust, this box was clean, recently accessed. Danny's hands shook slightly as he examined it without touching. The box had no markings, but its presence made no sense in a residential attic. It was not connected to anything that should be in a typical American home. Following the wire in the other direction, Danny traced it down through the interior wall. His stomach tightened as he realized it ran directly into the wall cavity adjacent to Hammond's study, the room the man had specifically asked him not to enter. The cable television problem Danny was supposed to fix suddenly seemed very far from his mind. He sat motionless in the attic for several minutes, sweating despite the November cold seeping through the roof. Danny knew enough to understand what he might be looking at. This was not amateur radio equipment. This was not some eccentric home project. The careful installation, the deliberate concealment, the proximity to a study belonging to a man with government clearance, it all pointed toward something far more serious. Danny made his way back down from the attic, his mind racing. He needed to appear normal, to give no indication that anything unusual had caught his attention. Hammond was waiting at the bottom of the ladder, that same pleasant but watchful expression on his face. "Any luck finding the problem?" Danny said. Hammond asked. Still tracking it down, Danny replied, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "I think the issue might be in your cable distribution setup. I need to check the connections in each room to isolate where the signal degrades. Standard procedure." Hammond's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Take your time," he said, "though I do have a conference call scheduled in about an hour, so if you could avoid the study area until after that, I would appreciate it." "No problem," Danny said, already planning his next move. Back in his van, Danny radioed the Continental Cable Dispatch with a carefully worded message. He told them he had encountered a potential code violation at his current location and needed to speak with the supervisor immediately, in person, before continuing work. The dispatcher, puzzled but cooperative, said a supervisor would arrive within 30 minutes. Danny told Hammond there was a delay in getting necessary parts, that someone from the main office would be stopping by shortly with what he needed. Those 30 minutes felt like hours. Danny worked slowly, checking obvious connection points, making a show of testing signal strength with his equipment. Hammond appeared twice, offering coffee, making small talk about the unseasonably cold weather, asking how much longer the repairs might take. Each time, Danny noticed how Hammond's gaze lingered on his tool bag, how he seemed to mentally inventory what Danny had brought into the house. When Supervisor Frank Hutchins arrived, Danny met him at the van, out of sight from the house windows. Frank was a former Marine, someone Danny trusted. In a low voice, Danny described what he had found in the attic. Frank's expression transformed from irritation at being pulled away from his office to sharp attention. "You are absolutely certain about this?" Frank asked. Danny nodded. "I know what I saw, Frank. That is not residential wiring. That is not cable equipment. And the homeowner specifically did not want me in his study." Frank was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ordinary-looking house with its neatly trimmed hedges and the ceramic jack-o'-lantern still sitting on the front porch from Halloween. "We need to call this in," he finally said. "But we need to be smart about it. If you are right, if this is what you think it is, we cannot spook him." They decided on a strategy. Frank would enter the house, play the role of the supervisor, checking on a difficult installation. He would observe, verify what Danny had seen if possible, and then they would quietly contact the authorities. The key was maintaining the appearance of a routine service call. Inside the house, Frank introduced himself to Hammond with practiced professionalism. He explained that they were running behind schedule and that the installation would need to continue into the afternoon. Hammond's cordial facade showed its first real crack. "That is not acceptable," he said, his accent becoming slightly more pronounced under stress. "I have important work this afternoon. You must finish soon or reschedule." Frank insisted it was a complex problem requiring immediate attention, citing company policy about not leaving a customer with degraded service. While they talked, Danny made his way back to the attic, this time with Frank's small camera hidden in his jacket. He needed documentation. The photographs Danny took over the next 20 minutes would later appear in classified FBI reports and congressional briefings. The grey wire, the unmarked junction box, and most critically, additional equipment he discovered deeper in the attic. Behind layers of insulation, Danny found a small metal box no larger than a shoebox, carefully sealed in plastic and connected to what appeared to be an antenna wire running to the roof vent. The sophistication of the concealment was impressive. Without tracing that one wire, without that particular combination of thoroughness and trained suspicion, it might have remained hidden indefinitely. When Danny descended from the attic the final time, he found Frank still engaged in conversation with Hammond. The man's discomfort had grown palpable. He kept checking his watch, glancing toward his study door, radiating a nervous energy that seemed completely at odds with the patient suburban professional he had appeared to be that morning. Frank made the call from his van using the company radio, but instead of calling dispatch, he contacted a number he had been given years earlier during his own military service, a number for reporting potential security threats. Within 15 minutes, 2 unmarked sedans arrived on Sycamore Street. To any neighbor watching, they looked like additional cable company vehicles or perhaps consultants of some kind. Nothing alarming, nothing that would trigger concern. The men who emerged wore ordinary business attire, but moved with the precision of federal agents. They approached the van and identified themselves as FBI counterintelligence. Special Agent Thomas Marchetti took the lead, listening intently as Danny and Frank described their discovery. Marchetti made no immediate move toward the house. Instead, he made several phone calls, speaking in code phrases Danny did not understand. Over the next hour, more vehicles arrived, carefully spaced out to avoid drawing attention. Surveillance teams positioned themselves at both ends of the street. Technical specialists began setting up equipment in a van parked 3 houses down. The operation unfolded with choreographed efficiency, the kind that comes from years of practice. At 2:37 that afternoon, Richard Hammond emerged from his house carrying a briefcase and wearing an overcoat. He walked to his car, a beige sedan, with the stride of a man late for an appointment. Before he could start the engine, agents materialized from 3 directions. Hammond froze for precisely 2 seconds, his hand on the ignition key, and in that brief moment, Danny saw something fundamental change in the man's face. The pleasant suburban mask dissolved, replaced by something harder, more calculating, the look of a professional assessing a catastrophic failure. Richard Hammond was taken into custody without resistance. He said nothing, exercised his right to remain silent, and waited for lawyers with very specific instructions. The FBI agents entered the house with a warrant that had been prepared with remarkable speed, suggesting they had been building a case already but had lacked the final piece needed for action. What they found inside 4723 Sycamore Street would keep investigators busy for months. The study, the room Hammond had been so protective of, contained a false wall panel concealing a sophisticated communication station, shortwave radio equipment, one-time cipher pads, microfilm readers, dead drop coordinates, agent identification protocols, and enough classified material to compromise multiple ongoing intelligence operations. The equipment in the attic connected to a highly sensitive receiver, designed to pick up specific radio frequencies used by Soviet intelligence. The system allowed Hammond to receive encrypted messages from handlers without any direct contact, without telephone calls or suspicious meetings, a classic number station setup adapted for suburban American deployment. But the most damaging discovery came from Hammond's study safe, hidden behind a false electrical panel. Inside, agents found detailed reports on American defensive capabilities, stolen technical specifications for satellite surveillance systems, and profiles of dozens of potential recruitment targets. Junior government employees with security clearances, financial problems, personal weaknesses that could be exploited. The operation Hammond had been running was far larger than a single spy gathering information. He was a coordinator, a handler for a network. The case broke open quickly once FBI analysts began working through the seized materials. Within 72 hours, 3 additional arrests were made in Washington, Baltimore, and Philadelphia. 2 were American citizens who had been passing classified information for payment. The third was another Soviet illegal, a deep cover operative who had been living in the United States since 1967. Danny Kowalski and Frank Hutchins were debriefed extensively over the following weeks. FBI counterintelligence wanted to understand every detail of the discovery, every moment of the service call, looking for any possibility that Hammond had been tipped off or that the operation had been compromised in any way. Both men were required to sign secrecy agreements. The official story would be that Hammond was caught through routine surveillance, not because a cable installer had been doing his job thoroughly. The man known as Richard Hammond was eventually identified as Anatoly Mikhailovich Sokolov, a KGB officer who had been inserted into the United States in 1966 after 3 years of intensive training. His legend, the false identity he lived under, was nearly perfect. He had entered the country using documents belonging to a real Richard Hammond, who had died in a car accident in Canada as a teenager. The Soviets had obtained the birth certificate, built an entire paper trail, created a person who could pass any background check that did not involve fingerprints or DNA testing, technologies not widely used for security clearances in the late 1960s. Sokolov had attended college using student loans, established credit, married an American woman who never suspected his true identity, raised children who were as American as any in the neighborhood. He had been the perfect sleeper agent, activated gradually over years until he reached a position where his access to classified information, both through his own clearance and through the network he cultivated, made him invaluable to Soviet intelligence. His arrest sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. The case, given the codename Operation Broken Cable by the FBI, revealed vulnerabilities in the security clearance process and demonstrated the Soviet Union's commitment to extremely long-term intelligence operations. Agents willing to spend decades building cover stories, living entirely as Americans, represented a level of patience and resource investment that forced a complete reassessment of counterintelligence priorities. The trial of Anatoly Sokolov began in federal court in June of 1984. The proceedings were partially closed to protect intelligence sources and methods, but enough details emerged to make headlines across the country. Sokolov, through his lawyers, attempted to negotiate an exchange, offering information about Soviet intelligence operations in exchange for repatriation to Russia. The Reagan administration, taking a hard line on espionage, refused. Testimony revealed the full scope of the operation. Sokolov had been responsible for coordinating information from at least 15 sources, some witting agents who knew they were working for Soviet intelligence, others unwitting sources who provided information they believed was going to friendly analysts or industrial competitors. The intelligence he had gathered and transmitted to Moscow over 17 years included weapons specifications, defensive radar capabilities, satellite deployment schedules, and detailed assessments of American military readiness. One of the most chilling aspects revealed during the trial was how close Sokolov had come to accessing even more sensitive information. He had been cultivating a relationship with a Department of Defense contractor who worked on ballistic missile systems. The contractor, testifying under immunity, admitted he had been on the verge of providing technical documents, drawn in by what he thought was legitimate consulting work that would earn him extra money for his daughter's college tuition. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Anatoly Sokolov was convicted on 17 counts of espionage, conspiracy, and illegal entry into the United States. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms in federal prison without possibility of parole. His wife, who testified she had no knowledge of his true identity, was not charged but faced her own devastating reckoning. Her marriage was a lie. Her children's father was not who they believed. Her entire adult life had been built on a foundation of deception. For Danny Kowalski, the experience changed everything and nothing. He continued working as a cable installer for 2 more years before the stress of maintaining secrecy about his role in the case became too much. He transferred to the company's commercial division, working on office building installations where the work was straightforward, and the chances of stumbling into international espionage were effectively zero. Frank Hutchins received a commendation from the FBI, presented in a private ceremony where he was told his quick thinking and proper procedures had prevented a potential intelligence disaster. The commendation remains classified, tucked in a file somewhere in the Bureau's headquarters, another secret of the Cold War. The house on Sycamore Street was eventually sold, though it took nearly 2 years to find a buyer willing to purchase a home that had been at the center of a major espionage case. The neighbors, who had been interviewed repeatedly by FBI agents and journalists, developed a lasting wariness of newcomers. The comfortable assumption that everyone in the neighborhood was exactly who they claimed to be had been shattered. The broader impact of Operation Broken Cable extended far beyond one case. The FBI intensified its counterintelligence efforts, implementing new protocols for monitoring individuals with security clearances. Background check procedures were enhanced to include more thorough verification of personal histories going back to childhood. The idea that a Soviet agent could live undetected in suburban America for nearly 2 decades was a wake-up call. Intelligence analysts studying the case identified several red flags that had been missed over the years. Hammond had traveled abroad more frequently than most people in his position, always with seemingly legitimate business or personal reasons. His financial situation was slightly better than his salary would suggest, though not enough to trigger suspicion. Explained away by careful budgeting and a small inheritance, he maintained a social circle that was friendly but not intimate, never developing the kind of deep friendships that might expose inconsistencies in his background. Most troubling was that Hammond had passed every security clearance review he had been subjected to over 17 years. His cover story was so well constructed, his legend so carefully maintained, that the traditional tools of counterintelligence had failed to detect him. It took a chance discovery by someone with no intelligence training, but enough curiosity and thoroughness to follow an unusual wire to its source. The equipment found in Hammond's attic became a subject of intense study. Soviet technical capabilities in communications had been underestimated. The receiver system was more sophisticated than American intelligence had believed possible in such a compact form. Engineers spent months reverse engineering the devices, learning techniques that would inform American signals intelligence for years to come. The case also highlighted the human element of espionage work. Sokolov had maintained his cover through sheer discipline and psychological endurance, living a lie every day, never fully relaxing, always monitoring his speech for accent slips. His behavior for anything that might trigger suspicion required extraordinary mental fortitude. The stress of maintaining such a cover, especially while raising children who believed the lie, represented a level of personal sacrifice that was difficult for most people to comprehend. During his years in prison, Sokolov gave several interviews to intelligence historians, approved by the FBI as part of an assessment of Soviet espionage methods. He spoke of the loneliness of deep cover work, the surreal experience of living as someone else for so long that the line between cover identity and true self began to blur. He described the constant low-level anxiety, the hypervigilance required to catch potential mistakes before they happened, the elaborate mental compartmentalization needed to be Richard Hammond at home, while remaining Anatoly Sokolov in his core identity. He also spoke about the moment of his exposure, the instant he saw FBI agents approaching his car. In that moment, he said, along with the fear and the realization that his mission was over, there was an unexpected sense of relief. The burden of maintaining the lie could finally be set down. The exhausting performance was finished. In a strange way, being caught and imprisoned was less stressful than the years of pretending. The impact on his family was profound and lasting. His wife, who had believed she was married to Richard Hammond for 19 years, required extensive counseling. She had to confront the reality that the man she had built a life with did not exist, that every memory, every shared moment, was tainted by fundamental deception. Their children, teenagers when their father was arrested, struggled with identity crises of their own. If their father was not who they thought, what did that mean for their own understanding of themselves? They changed their names, moved to different states, tried to build new lives separate from the notoriety. The Soviet Union never publicly acknowledged Sokolov's work, a standard practice for captured illegals. In the wilderness of mirrors that defined Cold War intelligence, maintaining plausible deniability was paramount. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, files that might have contained details about the operation remained classified or were destroyed. Sokolov's place in Soviet intelligence history was never officially recognized. For the intelligence community, Operation Broken Cable became a case study taught at CIA headquarters, at FBI training facilities, at military intelligence schools. The case demonstrated both the sophistication of Soviet long-term operations and the importance of remaining vigilant even in the most seemingly innocent contexts. Future generations of counterintelligence officers studied the details, learning how a routine service call became the thread that unraveled a major spy network. The case also changed how certain professions approached their work. Cable installers, telephone repair workers, utility inspectors, anyone whose job took them into the hidden spaces of homes and offices received new training on recognizing suspicious equipment or unusual installations, while the likelihood of stumbling upon espionage equipment remained extremely remote. The potential value of awareness was deemed worth the effort. Danny Kowalski rarely spoke about his role in the case. When asked by friends or colleagues about the biggest thing that ever happened during his time as a cable installer, he would shrug and mention the time he had to wire a mansion with 47 televisions. The real answer, the truth about that November morning in Arlington, remained locked behind security clearances and secrecy agreements. Only his wife knew, and she understood the weight of that knowledge, the strange burden of being part of history that could not be openly acknowledged. In the broader context of the Cold War, Operation Broken Cable was one of many espionage cases, one more example of the shadow conflict between superpowers. But it held a unique place because of how it unfolded. This was not the result of a defector's information, not the product of years of electronic surveillance or decrypted communications. This was one person doing his job with unusual thoroughness, noticing something that did not belong, and trusting his instincts enough to report it. The randomness of it haunted Soviet intelligence planners when details of the case eventually reached Moscow through various channels. Sokolov's operation had been meticulous, his tradecraft nearly flawless. Yet he was undone by the decision to call for cable television repair, by the chance that the technician who responded was former military with communications training, by a combination of circumstances that could not have been predicted or prevented. It was a reminder that even the most carefully planned operations could fail due to factors beyond anyone's control. The Cold War eventually ended, the Soviet Union dissolved, and the urgent spy versus spy intensity of that era faded into history. But the lessons of cases like Operation Broken Cable remained relevant. The fundamental dynamics of espionage, the patient cultivation of sources, the construction of elaborate cover stories, the constant risk of exposure, these continued in the post-Cold War world, adapted to new conflicts and new adversaries, but unchanged in their essential nature. Today, the house on Sycamore Street looks like any other on the block. New owners, unaware of or indifferent to its history, have repainted the exterior, landscaped the yard, added a deck off the back. The attic where Danny Kowalski made his discovery has been cleaned and re-insulated. The study where Anatoly Sokolov maintained his secret communications equipment is now a home office with a computer desk and bookshelves. The neighborhood has turned over, younger families replacing the generation that lived through the shock of learning a spy had been among them. But in the archives of American intelligence, in the training manuals of counterintelligence professionals, the case remains alive. Photos of the equipment found in that attic, transcripts of Sokolov's interrogations, analysis of how the operation functioned and how it failed, all continue to serve as reference material. Every few years, a new generation of intelligence officers studies the case, trying to extract lessons applicable to contemporary threats. The story of how a cable television installer accidentally exposed a Soviet spy became, in intelligence circles, a kind of parable about the importance of thoroughness, awareness, and trusting one's instincts. Danny Kowalski had not set out to catch a spy. He had simply refused to do a superficial job, had followed an anomaly to its source, had recognized that something did not fit. In doing so, he achieved what entire counterintelligence units working for years sometimes failed to accomplish. The irony was that Sokolov's downfall came not from a flaw in his spycraft, but from the routine failure of a cable television signal, a technical problem he probably could have ignored. If he had been willing to miss the evening news for a few more weeks, if he had waited for the problem to become unbearable before calling for service, the timeline might have been different. The FBI investigation that was already beginning to circle his operation might have gotten the evidence they needed through other means, or the surveillance might have continued for months or years, monitoring his activities, mapping his network, before moving to arrest. Instead, on a cold November morning in 1983, impatience and the normal desire for functioning home electronics created an opportunity for discovery. A service call that should have been routine became the beginning of the end, and a cable installer who was simply trying to do his job thoroughly stumbled into history. For those who knew the full story, for the FBI agents and intelligence officers who worked the case, there was a certain satisfaction in how it unfolded. Espionage work is often frustrating, filled with dead ends and near misses, with the knowledge that for every spy caught, others likely remain undetected. Operation Broken Cable was a clear win. A major operation rolled up, a network dismantled, intelligence gathering halted. And it happened because someone noticed a wire that did not belong. The Cold War produced countless stories of espionage, some dramatic, some tragic, some absurd in their twists and complexity. The case of Richard Hammond, Anatoly Sokolov, the Soviet illegal who lived the American dream while betraying it, who was caught because he wanted to watch television without static, stands as one of the more unusual tales from that era. It reminds us that history sometimes turns on the smallest details, that great outcomes can emerge from ordinary circumstances, and that doing your job thoroughly, even something as mundane as installing cable television, can have consequences far beyond what anyone might imagine. The larger lesson, perhaps, is about the nature of vigilance in a democratic society. The United States could not function as a closed system where every citizen is under constant surveillance, where suspicion is the default stance toward neighbors. The openness that made American society attractive to immigrants, including Soviet intelligence officers posing as immigrants, also made it vulnerable. Finding the balance between security and freedom remained a constant challenge throughout the Cold War and beyond. Cases like Operation Broken Cable showed that security often depended not on massive surveillance apparatus, but on aware individuals willing to report anomalies when they encountered them. Danny Kowalski had not been trained in counterintelligence, had not been looking for spies, had simply recognized something unusual and taken appropriate action. In a society that valued individual initiative and responsibility, that approach aligned with democratic principles while still providing security. The decades since the Cold War ended have brought new threats and new forms of espionage, cyber infiltration and digital surveillance, replacing some of the human intelligence gathering that dominated the earlier era. But the fundamental principles remain unchanged. Intelligence work still requires patience, deception, and the exploitation of access. Counterintelligence still requires vigilance, thoroughness, and the willingness to question what seems normal. And sometimes, just sometimes, it requires a cable installer who decides to follow a wire he does not recognize to see where it leads. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.